Hello, well, welcome to the first in a series of amateur videos in which we will be renovating an old Victorian spinning rod. This is the rod here. It is what they call a whole cane spinning rod made with brass fittings and bamboo. Okay, so in this first video what I'm going to do is I'm going to make some measurements, and then I'm just going to briefly show you the style of ring that we are going to try to make. So the style of ring that we're going to try to make is like this, but because it's a spinning rod it needs to be quite a bit bigger, so we're going to make one around about that size. So what we then do is we then measure the thickness of fishing rod at this point, which is the lower section with the handle, and that's 16 millimeters. And then we measure between here and here, which is the location of the old rod eye. You can just see here, well, you bit on my finger probably. You can just see here where the windings used to be, and here where the windings used to be. So you can see the original rod eye was quite a large rod eye, and that is 83 millimeters. Okay, so in this next section of the video I'm going to start by making the ring for the spinning rod. So we're going to need some 2mm brass wire, and then we're going to need a forming tube, which is actually just a piece of pipe really, and then we're going to need a rawhide mallet, and we're going to need some shears, and we're going to need, guess what, a file. So in order to start this session, what I'm first going to do is I'm going to flatten the end of the copper wire. This is 2mm brass wire. Sorry, it's not copper, it's brass. And I'm going to flatten the end of it, because when you bring the ends of the loop around to join, you need to have two flat surfaces so that the solder can form a joint properly. Okay, so I'm going to file the end of this until it's flat. Okay, now that that's been done, what I'm essentially going to do is form the brass wire, 2mm brass wire, around a round former, using my hands mostly to start with. So you go a little bit over, just so you've got a nice curvature at the end there. Okay, so what I'm going to do next is I'm going to hold this over the former as tightly as possible to try and get the exact size of the ring correct. So I've marked it slightly over, and then I'm going to cut it now with the shears. Right, so now we have a ring which is approaching, hopefully let's just check, approaching the size of the other ring that we've got here, because we're going to tack these two together. At some stage to make a nice strong fishing rod ring. So the next stage is to hone this so that it's even closer to the correct size and get it exactly right. and then again another cut. So we're pretty well at a size which is exactly the size of the former. Okay, so once we've done that, I'm now going to file it so that it's got a nice and flat surface, because the shears leave a kinch on the surface. Right, okay, so in this next section what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold the ring towards itself until the two ends come together. Now you may be thinking, whoa, that's not very round. Well, in actual fact, at this stage it doesn't really matter, because making it round is actually the next stage. So I've just filed that essentially so that it matches up. So you should have a fairly tight join by the time you've finished. So I don't know if you can see this here, but essentially push the ring so that they're just slightly across each other, and then you bring them together like so, and they should just hang together like that. It's nice, and you need to just tweak it a little bit until they sit true. And don't worry about it being distorted looking at this stage, because that's the next stage. What you've got to do is concentrate on getting the wee joint exactly marked up, which that is. Okay, so now that we've got our ring pretty much together now with a nice joint, essentially the surfaces were filed so they're nice and clean, and the surfaces at the edges there are also nice and clean. We'll maybe give them a little bit of a going over with the emery cloth, but they are actually pretty good. They don't need a lot of work. So what I'm going to show you next is borax. So silversmiths use borax, and it's a flux that you put onto the joint, and it draws the solder into the joint. It also protects the joint from oxidation, so that you get a good stick of the solder effectively. So the way that borax works is you get a small amount of water, and you can use a teaspoon or something to do this. You don't have to, and you basically grind it like this. And this is a traditional technique that is used by silversmiths and has been used by silversmiths for many years. And there's absolutely nothing new about it. It's one of the oldest. It's one of the oldest ways to put flux onto soft metal soldering, such as brass, copper, silver, and so on. So now we've got our solder flux paste, and we have a solder flux paste brush, which is here, and then we basically run the flux onto the surface. When it dries, it forms a slightly matte looking white coating on the surface of the ring, and it actually dries pretty quickly. I mean, it dries within 30 seconds or so in most cases. So I'm going to solder this with silver brazing solder. So that's what you see here in my hand here. As you can see, it's hard. Yeah, this is the hard grade of silver solder. Silver solder comes in 3 grades: easy, medium and hard, and what they are essentially is the temperature. So when you're constructing the first pieces of something like this, you generally use the harder grade, so that later on when you're trying to finish it off, it doesn't just fall apart. Because you finish it later with easy solder, which is a lower temperature, and it doesn't just fall apart. So that's what I'm also stalling for time while this dries. So there we go. We put some solder paste onto the joint there. So I'm now going to take this out and solder it with a blow